Hi, and welcome back to our reading of The Red Lion by Marie-Antoinette. It has been a while. It seems to take a little longer to get this in the can, so to speak, as we're nearing completion. And, you know, along the lines of reincarnation, which is what this book is all about, we're approaching the French Revolution, and it's all a little uncomfortable to me. So who knows, maybe we were there. We're going to read chapter 34. It's the Trianon. In French, I think it's like the Trianon. But I'm not going to say that every time. So there is a lot of French in this chapter, and I'll do my best. And, you know, so it's interesting. We see in the previous chapter, and we'll see it again in this chapter, how the nobility and others are almost engineering a setup for the revolution to take place, right? And it just brings my thoughts onto the scene today. How, you know, who is it that are designing the social incidents and everything that happens? And you get, you know, look back through the history and see how these people are either through ignorance or just direct malevolence creating these situations for their own privilege, for their own selfish interests, and it doesn't end well. You know, we see how Marie-Antoinette, for example, is isolated, is used as a figurehead, and thoughts go back to Tsarina Alexandra of Russia, who also came to that country from Western Europe and was in a similar situation. Wasn't able to reach out to her people, didn't quite understand perhaps how things were going, and that too didn't end well. So we see the parallels through history, and these people are using other people to manipulate turns of the tide. Anyway, chapter 34, the Trianon. The Dauphin was born in 1781 on the very date predicted by Saint Germain. Everywhere there were jubilant festivities, and it seemed as though all the suspicion and misunderstanding between the Queen and the people had evaporated. The nobility was silent for the moment, and glorifying odes replaced the slanderous poems addressed to the king's consort. She was the mother of the heir to the throne and was received enthusiastically everywhere. To her credit, Marie-Antoinette did not forget Saint Germain in her victorious maternity. The Countess Polignac brought us her invitation to the Trianon in person. She was even pleased to mention my own humble person. Since I had been present for the prophecy, I should also be present for the fulfillment. Thus, we were invited to the Trianon, that small Rococo palace that stubbornly isolated itself from the world. There will be just a few of the Queen's close friends there, the Countess told us. Just a few gay and entertaining people among whom the Queen desires to rest from the fatigues of her obligations. Marie-Antoinette worshipped this Countess Polignac and followed her smooth and tactful guidance blindly. Unfortunately, the Countess was wed to her own family interests and was neither astute nor sympathetic enough to guide the reckless, sentimental Queen properly. If she had only realized the danger of that tiny fairy tale palace that opposed Versailles and alienated Paris, she might have changed the Queen's fate when the blow did fall. But it was more important to her and her family that no one else have any influence upon Marie-Antoinette, and they virtually isolated her in a vacuum. The Queen left her little citadel only to go to the seething, scandalized Versailles to get more money for the Polignacs or else for the Trianon itself. It consumed vast amounts of money. Physically, the Countess was more beautiful even than the Princess de Lamballe. Her loveliness and grace misled the Queen and everyone else who could be deceived by skillful acting. Really, the delicate, fragile figure with the narrow Madonna face and wide, innocent eyes were signs of a personality that needed constant attention and protection. Her entreating, tinkling voice could both flatter and evade, and there was incredible tenacity hidden in that graceful, transparent figure. She could instantly recognize both possible advantages and possible dangers, and her tongue was a light, lethal weapon to execute opponents. It was entirely a different woman that I met that evening amid the pastel tapestries, musically curved furniture, and petal-like porcelains. 1,000 candles sparkled and multiplied in the mirrors, and she came tripping over the soft carpet like a reflection of their grace. There was no sign of the sorrowful, anxious person I had met the year before. Marie-Antoinette was the very personification of Rococo, a lovely, gracious pink goddess who stretched out slender fingers to acknowledge our homage with generous gratitude. "Come, my lord, I want to announce your marvelous wisdom and ability to the world." She took his arm and led him toward her gay, curious guests. There was an inimitable rhythm in her walk that evening. She seemed almost to float, totally unaffected, fresh and vibrant. An atmosphere of joy and victory surrounded her, and even this second birth had not affected her figure. Her waist was still waspy over her blue brocade crinoline, and her naked powdered arms and neck sparkled with jewels, as did her towering wig. The guests were young, handsome, and richly dressed. There was only one withered and overpainted beldame among them, the spirited and wickedly witty Countess d'Adhémar. I understood later why she was accepted by this youthful elite. She was their court jester, a distorting glass who mirrored their carnival antics. But how hard she worked to maintain that position! What an effort it cost her to camouflage her age and looks under a barrage of ribald stories. They expected her to entertain them, and she bent all her talent and energy to do so. Now the whole group crowded around Saint Germain, asking for prophecies, beauty preparations, and the elixir. They asked childish questions and said stupid, frequently insulting things. He bore it all with equanimity and provided an answer for everybody. Finally, the Queen rescued him from this embarrassing situation. She came up with the Princess de Lamballe and the Countess Polignac and asked him to go into another room and give her some private medical advice. Now, my habit of being inconspicuous became useful. I simply withdrew into a small, ill-lit salon and watched the chattering groups through the open door. The Countess d'Adhémar soon dominated the conversation, announcing that she had some exclusive inside information about Count Saint Germain. It seemed the Countess had been at a gathering during which the elderly Countess de Gergy had suddenly come face to face with the famous Magus. The old woman had stepped back in amazement. "I met you in Venice," she told him, 50 years ago when my husband was ambassador. You looked just like you do now, except now you look younger." The Count had bowed deeply. "You honor me by your recognition, Countess." "But you called yourself the Marquis Baletti, then?" Saint Germain smiled. "The Countess de Gergy's memory is as good as it was 50 years ago." "Well, I certainly wouldn't forget the man whose medications are responsible for both my memory and my health. I am happy to renew my acquaintance with one of the strangest men in the world, no matter what he calls himself." "I hope the Marquis Baletti did not have a bad reputation," Saint Germain said. "On the contrary," the Countess responded eagerly. Saint Germain took her arm and escorted her to their hostess. As they left, he murmured over his shoulder to the Countess d'Adhemar, "In that case, I gladly acknowledge my grandfather." This incident came to the ears of the Marquise de Pompadour, and her curiosity was so great that she taxed Saint Germain directly. The Countess d'Adhemar heard all about their subsequent conversation from Madame du Hosset, the Marquise's lady-in-waiting. It was known that Saint Germain enjoyed the confidential friendship of both the king and the Marquise and could enter their suites freely at any time. He was very tactful about using this privilege and never came at the wrong moment. When he came, he was always expected and wanted. Thus it was after his meeting with the Countess de Gergy. The Marquise de Pompadour was excitedly telling her lady-in-waiting about the incident when suddenly Saint Germain appeared before them. They had not seen him come in, and Pompadour was truly frightened. "This is witchcraft!" she burst out. "How did you get here just as we were talking about you?" "It was natural enough, madame. You called, and I came." "But I hadn't sent for you. I haven't even gotten out of my chair." "But you were thinking about me and wanting to ask me some questions. Am I not right?" "Yes, it is true enough." "Then I am entirely at madame's service." The Marquise just shook her head helplessly. "What am I to do with you when I try to pin you down about something? You manage to evade me and say only what you want to. I suppose I must stifle my curiosity and put up with your mysterious ways. Sometimes I think you just enjoy being mysterious and are intentionally obscure. But at other times I am completely under your spell. I would swear you have supernatural powers. Yet the only thing I am sure of is that your friendship and advice are indispensable." "You have been sincere with me, madame," Saint Germain replied. "I will be sincere with you." "Did you really meet the Countess de Gergy in Venice 50 years ago?" "Yes." "But that would mean you're over 100 years old." "Is that so impossible, madame?" "I should say so. You can't be more than 40. "I cannot make you a liar, Marquise. The Countess de Gergy, though I respect her greatly, obviously must have talked nonsense." "You're evading again, but this time I'll pin you down. I have no reason to doubt the Countess's story, however fantastic it may be. She also told me you gave her an elixir that made her look no older than 24 for several years." "That is possible." "Well, did you or did you not give it to her?" "I gave it to her, but the Countess has exaggerated its effects. It merely healed her indigestion and replaced certain natural substances in her system. This restored her beauty." "Why can't you give the king a remedy like that?" "The king doesn't need it," Saint Germain said. "How can you say that? You know that some days he is dizzy and suffers tormenting headaches. Why could not he too be made fresh and young?" "I have already given the king advice on that matter." "And?" "He will not follow it." "You are such a charming creature, madame, and the young ladies you so generously bring the king are so irresistible." "You mean to say he abuses his strength?" "You know it as well as I do, madame. You also know that neither one of us can stop him. If you did not supply him, he would go to others." "That is true," Pompadour replied sadly. Saint Germain had touched her deeply. Her face became thoughtful, and it was obvious she was thinking of something that troubled her greatly. She tried to conceal the tremor in her voice as she continued. "If I dared ask, but I will ask you, Count Saint Germain, how long can I keep the king? And if I lose him, God forbid, what will happen to me then?" "No, don't answer. I don't have the courage to face it. It tortures me more and more as time goes on." She glanced uncertainly at Saint Germain, whose face was gentle as he returned her gaze. Madame du Hozet said he seemed to be looking at the beautiful Pompadour with pity. "Do not be frightened, madame. I will not alarm you. Your star is still in the ascent, but stars, you know, are like people. They die and are reborn. Even the finest child is born under the sentence of death, and those who die in one place are reborn elsewhere. It is like the evening when we sleep to wake in the realm of dreams. One chapter of life closes, and an even more important one begins. Change is a law, madame, but it is also a law that no change extinguishes life." This was a story that the Countess d'Adhémar had gotten from Madame du Hozet. Now the Queen returned with Saint Germain and her two friends. She was smiling, and laughter bubbled beneath her voice. The curious Countess threw out an opening gambit. "It seems the wonderful Count has brought your Majesty more good news." Marie-Antoinette seated herself among her guests. "Perhaps. Is it a secret?" the Countess persisted. "No," the Queen's silvery laughter flooded the room. "He says I'll have two more children and inner stability as well." "I can believe the two children," the Countess d'Adhémar responded dryly. "Oh, stop laughing." The Queen made a mischievous face at her. "I can grow up as well as anybody else." "May we beg your Majesty not to?" the Countess Polignac intervened. "Come, Count Saint Germain, can't you give the Queen an elixir that would make her an irresistible child forever?" Saint Germain shook his head with a smile. "I am sorry, Countess. God has ordained that children should grow up, and I can't work against him." "Oh, what a shame," the Countess Polignac responded. "Adults are so boring." Saint Germain responded, saying, "Then perhaps you ladies do not know the tale of the Isle of the Children." Saint Germain glanced around the eager group. They had not heard the tale and clamored for him to tell it. And thus goes the tale of the Islands of the Two Children. Many, many thousands of years ago, he began, there were two emerald islands in the Mediterranean Sea. These islands were really the peaks of two mountains which had once been the landmarks of a sunken world empire. Millions had fled the terrible cataclysm, but only a few managed to reach these mountaintops that became the Happy Isles. When the storm was over and the angry vault of heaven was again a brilliant blue, the survivors organized themselves on one of the twin islands. Using the memories of their advanced culture, they built permanent homes, cultivated the soil, tamed wild animals for domestic purposes, and followed all the useful scientific pursuits. They recreated their culture's laws of peaceful coexistence, which were based on ancient revelations, and established a society that would be of benefit to their children. But the children, in the meantime, while the adults labored, had roved unsupervised among the rocks and had become used to irresponsible freedom. They would plunder birds' nests and drink the raw eggs, or kill small game with stones and share their prey. All this made them muscular and rough-skinned, and they became boastful and competitive because of their physical strength. They thought it was fun to fight and believed they could get anything they wanted by beating someone else. Their emotions were unbridled and they had no patience. When the adults had completed their labors and believed it time for their children to take over, they called in these children to teach them their new duties and the law. Great was the sorrow of these wise and gentle people when they saw the feral herd that appeared before them. They became painfully aware of the fact that while they had labored, their children had been left to become wild. Their bodies were strong enough, but they were mentally lazy, and their emotions were like unchecked weeds. The adults tried to enlighten the coarse minds and to teach self-control and consideration for others, but it was in vain. Their youngsters abhorred their efforts and in the stupid arrogance of their physical power revolted against the leadership of the elders. They went off to the other island to establish their own free child empire. The first thing they did was to build droll houses of branches whose roofs were decorated with flowers. These funny green tents were quite gay in the sun, but soon it was noticed that some were larger and more beautiful than others. These had been built by children who were physically weak but more clever mentally than the others. The strong ones who excelled in fighting had not been able to produce anything but shapeless, ugly lean-tos, for their hands and minds were clumsy and unskilled. Immediately the strong forced the weak to leave their beautiful dwellings so they could have them. When they saw that the weak were easily intimidated, they became drunk with power. They compelled the weak to do all the drudgery while they occupied themselves with hunting, fishing, and dancing around the fire. In addition, they took all the best food and allowed the weaker children only scraps. Meanwhile, the weak children, made weaker yet by hunger, hard labor, and abuse, became embittered. Their suffering and oppression produced growing enlightenment. The strong children, on the other hand, became fat and lazy from their intemperate eating. It did not take them very long to gather all the food they needed, so they spent most of the day eating, sleeping, and abusing their slaves. Nor did their violence stop there. The fat tyrants began to quarrel among themselves with increasing frequency. The slaves witnessed their daily outbursts and the way they abused each other over trifles. They watched the raging fights in which their masters bit and tore one another like wild beasts. They saw the defeated grovel in helpless rage, and the slaves began to think. Were the strong ones really as invulnerable as they had thought? After all, they died off steadily. Their bodies had grown fat and soft from luxurious living, and their reflexes were no longer swift. They slept until high noon, while fish teemed in the lakes, wild fruits hung ripe from the trees, and grain blown over from the other island made luscious wheat fields ripe for harvesting. The climate was so mild and beneficent that food in abundance could be gotten free. But the fat tyrants had become too lazy even to reach up and pick the fruit above their heads. The slaves had to do all this for them while they sprawled in the shade, and then they ate their fill before giving those slaves meager scraps. Why? Because they had made a mutual agreement? After all, the tyrants in power weren't even physically superior anymore. The slaves had become more agile and tenacious, for they had had to build the fires, fish, hunt, and tan hides. They knew, too, how to bear trouble and suffering, and they were in the majority. At first, only a few thought like this, and they kept their magnificent, terrifying thoughts to themselves. Then some decided to change the rules. When they made a catch, they ate what they wanted first and then gave the scraps to the masters. The tyrants immediately responded by executing the rebels in front of the stony eyes of their comrades to deter them from committing similar improprieties. They tortured them to death in all the ways their inexhaustible ingenuity could invent. Some were flayed alive and had salt rubbed on their raw flesh. Some were cut to pieces as slowly as possible. Others were flogged to death or crushed beneath large rocks. Still others were immersed in water filled with leeches. Not surprisingly, every such example multiplied the number of sinners. Soon there were intrepid bands instead of lone rebels. The machinery of execution came to be used almost every day. It stank of rotting blood. Meanwhile, the weather had become oppressively hot, and the air was filled with the tension that precedes a rainstorm. The fat tyrants were preparing a new festival of execution. They had managed to drive crowds of escaped slaves out of the caves and expected to get the rest later. the noise of rats they heard with increasing frequency, the crude signs on the cave walls and the red flowers that were put on their houses every morning didn't bother them. The heat increased their impatience and restlessness. They were eager to work out their own tensions on the bodies of the tortured slaves. But the slaves were also awaiting the festival. They knew they were in the majority. The magic word had been spoken, like the sinister tolling of the death bell. Now they spoke other words as well. They talked about the diminished strength of their masters and their own newfound strength. They talked about the injustices they had suffered, nor did they forget to repeat the slanderous accusations their masters had shouted at each other in the rages, nor to tell the staggering secret they had learned during these fights. Their masters had bodies as vulnerable as their own, and blood just as red. The adults, who had continued their meditative life on the other island, learned what was happening on the Isle of the Children, and they were deeply saddened. They held a council and decided to send emissaries to both sides in an effort to keep the tension below the breaking point. But the emissaries could do no good. Emotions had flared too high. The tyrants were unwilling to give up their lives of luxury. They buried their heads in the sand like ostriches and pretended nothing was wrong. As for the embittered and starving slaves, they had become obsessed with choking hatred for their masters. They were already a force ready to strike. All that was needed was a moment of ignition. Realizing the situation, the emissaries returned hastily to their own island before the Holocaust and reported to the council that their mission was hopeless. The group was overcome with compassion and sorrow, but their leader, who was the oldest and wisest adult, remained calm. "Why are you so upset because the law of nature is also the law on the Isle of the Children?" he asked them. "The forces must be balanced everywhere. No weight can be carried properly unless it is distributed properly. If it is not, by the law of reaction, it crushes the one who pushes it too far. How can these children learn this? From words? Words don't mean anything to them. They are simply symbols of reality. The children must experience the reality themselves before it means anything to them. Our emissaries have not really been ineffective. Their warning will lie dormant until after the flood of passionate events fulfills it. Then, when the passions abate, it will come to life and have living consequences. You know that flesh and blood that may be butchered are not identical to life." Then the peace of understanding came to the members of the council. They returned to their work and meditation and awaited the calm that would follow the storm. Thus Saint Germain ended his telling of the tale, and now only a few candles crackled in the salon at the Trianon. As Saint Germain's voice died away, silence reigned unbroken. His hearers sat quietly, overwhelmed by their feelings. The bird of gaiety had flown. The Queen's lips were pressed tightly together and her face was pale as she stared at the floor. Even the ever-watchful eyes of the Countess Polignac were turned inwards where troubled presentiments swirled in her thoughts. The Princess de Lamballe seemed completely withdrawn, her hands clasped as though desperately praying. The ugly bird-like face of the Countess d'Adhémar seemed suddenly old and tired. Two servants came in and put fresh candles in the chandeliers. This broke the spell. What happened on the other island?" the Countess d'Adhémar asked hoarsely. "On the Isle of the Children?" Saint Germain turned and looked at her gravely. "It happened just as the adults had foreseen. The festival was turned into a bloodbath. The slaves massacred their masters, and when they had killed all of them, they turned on the slaves who had been faithful to their masters, then on those who had been indifferent to the struggle, and finally on those who had not been sufficiently brutal in their murdering. The lovely island became a slaughterhouse in which no one could be sure that his turn would not come next. Saint Germain's voice was soft, but his audience was spellbound. No one thought of gathering food or carrying on the normal tasks of life. Everyone was celebrating the victory that had turned into a Holocaust. Starvation was general now, and epidemics began to break out. On top of all this, a tropical storm washed away their crude houses, which had sheltered their dark lust for murder. Shivering and sick, they finally had to face their true situation. "And then they must have remembered the adults," murmured the Countess Tademar. Saint Germain replied, "Not yet, madame. That was still far in the future. The time I speak of was just a lull, not a resolution. There was much more strife yet to come, for the children did not yet understand the law of balance. There was always one individual or a small group who pushed the burden onto others before it came back to crush them." That was a horrid story, the Queen broke in angrily. "If I had known what it was about, I wouldn't have let you tell it. How could you do this to me?" Her voice choked with resentment. "I was so happy this evening." "It was only a story," Saint Germain responded. "Did your Majesty imagine there was some other meaning to it?" "I can readily imagine what you meant by telling it." The Queen stared at him coldly. "I know very well, and all I can say of the matter is that it is only a stupid, brutal nursery tale." She rose and turned her back on Saint Germain. The ladies lingered a little while longer, but the Queen did not speak further to the Count. She soon retired, pleading fatigue. And that is the end of chapter 34. The next chapter is called Two Letters, and it's correspondence with Saint Germain and the Countess d'Ademar. And it's interesting, Saint Germain's tale of the children could bring to mind the new theories of raising kids back in the 60s and 70s, where they were to have no boundaries and face no consequences for their actions or anything like that, for their parents to sort of have them not live through the hardships they themselves had lived through, and then by that they would miss a number of important life lessons. And we might be still dealing with that today, but as in this book, we live and we reincarnate, and hopefully we learn. See you in the next chapter.